All right, I've got 3 minutes after the hour, so we'll get cracking now. Good morning, I'm Steve Adicott, Cavion's Vice President of Client Services, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by one of my colleagues, Cavion's Chief Scientist, Dennis Maines, but also two friends of the house. We've got Jennifer Semko, who is a partner at Baker & McKenzie. She is an attorney who specializes in testing. Most of her clients are testing organizations. And we also have Microsoft's Carrie Davis. She's the Anti-Piracy Program Manager for Microsoft Learning. We've got a great session today with lots of really terrific content to share on everything you need to know to implement a data forensics program. Next slide, please. Dennis is going to conduct an introduction to data forensics, and then Carrie is going to share some really important thoughts on program implementation and obtaining budget and support. Then Jennifer is going to talk about the legal foundations of a data forensics program, some of the legal issues to be aware of, and how data forensics can support security investigations. So really great content. Again, everyone is going to be muted, but if you have a question, please type it into the question window in your GoToMeeting interface. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Dennis Maines and we'll get cracking. Dennis?
I've dropped off the webinar. I can't see anything. Hold on a minute.
We've got Introduction to Data Forensics is up, Dennis.
Okay, Introduction to Data Forensics. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about data forensics, what its purposes are, what you can use it for, and the things you need to be aware of. Next slide, please. A data forensics program is used to measure and manage risk. That's our main goal. We say you can't manage what you don't measure. The goal is that we want to ensure the tests are given, that they're valid, they're fair, that people are not losing, being taken advantage of. And we use the statistics to monitor and investigate what's going on with the program. It's all about loss, mitigating loss and liability. So just a couple of quick little stories. I always like to tell these. In November 2007, Channel 4 News in Denver got wind or got an anonymous tip. There was some shenanigans happening at the airport. They went out there, they were undercover with a button cam or something like that, and they actually recorded on tape instructors giving candidates questions to the test while they were taking the test. These people were being certified to de-ice aircraft. So that's huge, to not have certified people to know how to actually de-ice airplanes. According to Steve, he says they never pay those people enough. July 2011, the governor commissioned a special investigation in Atlanta public schools. They finished their report, delivered it to the governor. It was made public in July of 2011. And they named 178 educators who they felt had really cheated on the exams, tampered with the answer booklets in order to raise scores in Atlanta public schools. Huge loss to citizens of Atlanta and to the people, to the students. Those are the ones who really lost. So next slide, Scholar. We have data forensics. I like to just say it's the science of examining the data to find potential security risks. And so there are clues in the data that we're just going to look for. I'm not going to talk about these in detail. I want to make sure we have time for other things. I love this quote, though, at the bottom by Sherlock Holmes. We balance probabilities and choose the most likely. It's the scientific use of the imagination. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. It's not certain, right? It's statistics. There's always uncertainty with anything we're doing, so we want to take our steps in an appropriate manner. Let's go forward, Skylar. Examples of statistics. So just here's a partial list. We look for perhaps pre-knowledge on the exams with specific statistics, or collusion where people don't do their own work, or maybe tampering like what happened in Atlanta, where the educators were changing the answers on the answer sheet documents. Sometimes we see these improbable increases in scores and improvements, and the gains are so huge we wonder, did they have knowledge? Was the content disclosed? Often with certification exams, we look at email addresses. There's risks there when people share email addresses. People might go to foreign countries to take tests. I remember an individual from a country in Europe who ended up going to India to take the test. He passed, if I remember right, 10 certifications in about 2 weeks' time, and thought it was all legitimate. Didn't sound legitimate to me. But in response time, sometimes people answer questions and pass the test. It's just unusually and probably fast times, superhuman rates. So those are examples of the kinds of things we can look at. Next slide. So this graph here, this test security scale, is something I came up with as I was writing a chapter about a year ago. And we are measuring statistical anomalies with data forensics. So these are unusual things. They don't fit our models. And the point of this graphic is you have different kinds of other events that occur that relate to the security of the exams. You have overlap that is not complete containment of the anomalies within test fraud or security breaches. And not everything that's related to security is fraud. It could be just two people were supposed to be at all times with the secure test materials. Only one person was with them at one time or another. That would be a violation of security, but not necessarily fraud. Fraud is intent. Next slide, please. So I have this slide here based on this article that came out in 2010 in a journal. And they've asked educators about different ways that they could perhaps cheat on tests. And I extracted these 4 areas. First, there's theft, followed up with disclosure. This often happens with brain dump sites. There are people working together, or we say non-independent test taking, or maybe they're sharing, they're communicating with each other, or they're getting information during the exam. That's another area. If the rules for the administration of the exam are violated, it's intentional, right? Fraud is always intentional. That's another area. And tampering or manipulating the score distribution. So those are 4 big areas. And nearly all test security violations will end up in being one of those areas. So that's what we want. We want statistics that help us in each area. Next slide, please. There are 2 uses we put to the data. First, we just look at the data regularly and monitor for potential problems. Once we find something that we feel like needs more scrutiny, then we'll look at the data, do a deep dive, and we investigate. Still looking for data, not necessarily asking questions at this point, trying to get enough information to know how we can inform our investigators and know where we're going and how we might take corrective action to repair any issues or respond to or recover from those. Some actions might be scoring validations, closing test sites, refurbishing test items, etc. So, next slide, please. Just talking a little bit about monitoring. So we look at all of the data. So it's like, you go out and you turn over every single leaf, every single rock, when you do that, you're going to find strange things. So we have to be really careful to make sure we're not just finding a lot of strange things. It's just noise because we're finding unusual things. So that's what this spawn-promoting correction is all about. It's making sure that we are conservative. We're taking a principled approach because we're doing data mining in the monitoring context. We're looking at everything. Another part of what we want to do here is we're going to build lists, but in order to make these lists of anomalies, we want to have an objective measure, and we usually like to see probabilities, statistical probabilities in the context of all of the data, or what we call the population in the baseline models. Those probabilities allow us to be objective about what we're doing. If our models are good, we'll have some really strong places to make inference from. You know, if they're not so good, well, then it might be a little bit more loose. Often, if we have multiple probabilities, we can combine those together. This is an area where we've done a lot of research. How can we combine all these different kinds of disparate statistics to strengthen our evidence? Another thing probabilities allow that's really critical is being able to control the error rates. Next slide, please. It's all about inference. We have the anomalies. Now we want to make some inference about what may have happened. And the question is, what kind of data do you need to make inference? And are you comfortable making that inference? So it comes down to the strength of the evidence and what the inference is you're trying to make. For example, to make an inference that someone committed fraud is very different than to make an inference to say this test score is not trustworthy. Very different. And usually that's where we want to go with data forensics. Is talk about scores, not people. And we want to look at this, how this information comes together. A lot of psychometricians want an eyewitness account. The proctor actually saw the cheating. That's usually not going to happen. So we have to resort to statistics. So we say, well, let's back it off and find something very strong. For example, in this case, two individuals with 500-word essays that were identical. That would be very strong. So, well, next slide, please. So just context, I've been trying to talk about these statistics and talk about what we're really dealing with here, and it's circumstantial evidence. It's not direct proof. We all recognize that. Well, circumstantial evidence requires a deduction, requires some logical thinking, it requires an inference. Part of that means you look at the data, you look at the situation, and you look for other alternative or plausible explanations for what might have happened. If those are reasonable, then perhaps you should not take action. But if you cannot find anything that is really plausible, you probably have a very strong piece of evidence here that would justify taking action. If you have more than one piece of evidence, that helps. And it's very important in the process, we're going to talk about this later, but documenting everything you have so you can put together a story and apply your policy consistently for everyone. That's what it needs to be fair, it needs to be balanced, and it needs to be objective. So I have this last quote here. I'm not going to read it. You can read that. But it is very important to put a solid foundation around the inference that you're creating and drawing here. Okay, I think we have questions. Is that right?
Yeah, and we do have one, Dennis. And the question is, could you please explain ensemble statistics a bit more closely?
Sure. Often in statistics we find things that are related or associated. Ensemble statistics would be to take two statistics and combine them together. For example, a high-pass evidence of collusion or non-independent test taking. If you combine that together, that would be an ensemble statistic. Another example would be you had an increase in scores from like 2001 to 2002, which is what Jacob and Levitt observed, and then a decrease from 2002 to 2003. You have those two statistics you can combine together. That's an ensemble statistic.
Terrific. No other questions at this point, Dennis. And I think, if Skylar, if we move forward, we do have a poll now. We'd like to engage with the audience. And so this first question is, has the use of data forensics changed within your organization in the last year? Or I misread that a little bit. Has your organization's forensics, use of data forensics changed within the last year? And then we've got several options. So if you could please take just a moment and respond. And it looks like most people, 48%, are saying no changes, 41% increased emphasis, 11% more resources. We're going to got about 70% of folks, just a few more seconds here if you don't mind responding, and then we will close this. All right, I've got almost 80% have voted. We're going to close this. We're going to share the results. Pretty interesting. So only 2% are focusing less attention. Almost half, no changes from last year. 39% increased emphasis, and 11% more resources allocated. And now I'm going to hide that, and we'll continue. We've got another question, but I think in the we'll save that for later. Let's move to Carrie's portion of the presentation.
Hello, everyone. This is Carrie. I'm going to talk about program implementation. Go ahead, next slide. So the important thing to think about implementing a data forensics program is that it's part of a process. It's one part in your security plans. Data forensics can be used to improve the process. You could take your program to the next level. Data forensics can help you understand your gaps and your needs and help you enhance any efforts you're already doing. The use of data forensics can also help you assess your overall test security risks by identifying the strengths and weaknesses in your program and your process. So data forensics really provides that holistic view of what is going on in your testing program. Depending on what kind of statistics you want to look at, you can kind of see what parts of your program may need help and what parts are doing just fine. Data forensics can help you identify those behaviors and the trends of the programs you already have in place. Excuse me. The data forensics can also help you document your test security process. Once you identify any kind of strengths or weaknesses, then you can sit down and say, okay, what are we going to do about our test security here, or our exam delivery here, or whatever it is that you find. You can sit down and spell out the specific actions you want to take to address any findings that you get from your data forensics program. At that point, you can then take the steps you need to improve any processes you have. So in the box there, this is one goal, is that it should not be an improvement of test security, or it should be, sorry, I had that backwards. It should be to improve your test security, not to apprehend and punish potential cheaters. And I think that's a really good distinction, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But when you go to your stakeholders for support, you really need to stress that this is about overall test security and strengthening your program, not just ferreting out all the cheaters. Okay, so next slide. So for your general implementation, first you'll want to look at your program if you have one already. If you're just starting out on a test security program, then it's good that you're thinking about data forensics from the start. You'll identify your strengths and weaknesses. Then you can lay a foundation to your stakeholders on how data forensics will help your program, whether it's for the sole purpose of identifying the risks or for enforcement or just to get metrics. If you have a legal team, you may want to have a conversation with them first on your goals, see what you can do with that kind of data. You may want to talk to your exam delivery providers. What kind of forensics are they already doing? Can you share? Are they useful to your program? This is where you really want to think about the scope of what you want to do with that data. Dennis went over all kinds of different statistics and factors that he looks at, and you'll want to decide for yourself, what is our program's biggest concern right now? Do we want to know about collusion? Do we want to know about our test centers? Do we want to know about particular exams? Where your strengths and weaknesses are, you'll want to think about, how do I want to incorporate data forensics to address those? Then you'll want to think about budget, because most likely you will not have the budget that you want to spend on data forensics for everything. I know I don't. So will you do forensics on all of your exams, part of your program? You may want to target, for instance, your high-stakes exams, or maybe you want to target certain regions. Maybe you just want to do it by exam volume, or maybe your program is small enough that you can do it for everything, and that would be great. But you'll probably need to decide how and where you want to apply your overall resources and budget to data forensics. That's also important. Think about resources too, not just the dollars you'll spend on getting data forensics reports, but the resources you'll need in-house and out-of-house to really use those reports. For instance, people to analyze the results, people to provide the data, people to enforce any actions that you see need to be taken once you get those results. Resources from your exam delivery provider if you'll need to work with them on some things. Resources in redesigning exams or redeveloping them. So think about how data forensics can help your program overall, kind of from soup to nuts, from the exam concept all the way to the delivery of the exam. And what kind of resources and budget will you need to support your data forensics program? So at that point, you should have sort of a high-level plan that you can take to your stakeholders for their support. And I'm going to get more into stakeholder support here in a little bit. But one thing that you want to do is have a plan, a budget, and then kind of a promise to your stakeholders about what you're going to do with these reports once you get them. And then once you have your stakeholder support, you can begin to create the infrastructure. If you haven't already talked to your legal team, you might do it at this point. You'll want to get the right agreements in place. You'll want to talk about, okay, what can we do with the results and what enforcement actions do we want, or what kind of changes do we want to make? For instance, you may need to revise a candidate policy to include the use of forensics. You'll want to learn how to read the reports and what do they mean to your program. Train your staff, study the data, revise what you're measuring if what you find you get at first is not helpful. You may be fine-tuning your overall plan and policy as you learn how forensics work. Last, you'll want to implement any changes to your program, any enforcement actions that you plan to do, start gathering any metrics and putting them into meaningful reports for your stakeholders, and anything else that you promised to your stakeholders that you hope data forensics would do. That may not be immediate. For instance, I gathered reports from Cavion for probably 18 months now and still haven't really done anything with them, but I'm doing it in kind of a information gathering mode because I want to see how our program works overall, and then I can kind of decide on what I want to do with them. So it's okay, I think, to have a period of data collecting as long as that's what you promised your stakeholders. So next slide. So let's talk about stakeholder support. If you don't have stakeholder support and you have some data forensics that say that suggest that doing X, Y, Z might be a good idea, and if you don't have your stakeholder support around the data forensics, it's not going to do you any good. So you want to make sure that they have a fundamental understanding of what outcomes you expect from data forensics analysis. You know, they probably don't need to know it to the extent that Dennis does, but they do need to know how data forensics fit into an overall security assessment. If you have specific examples, you know, say you found cheating or you found that some locations had weak security, you want to present that to your stakeholders because that will help bolster your argument. Explain your workflow. Have a clear plan on what you're going to do with the data. You know, who is going to use it? How are you going to use it? How are you not going to use it? Again, that speaks to the idea that you may be using the results to strengthen your program, but you won't be using the results to find every cheater out there. It's really important to make sure that your stakeholders understand that. Always establish the scope of your data forensics program. Outline your costs associated with enforcement and analyzing the reports. Will you need additional resources? Will you need help from your outside counsel or exam delivery providers? And then factor in any legal resources you need. If you have an in-house legal team, you can talk to them, but if you have to use outside counsel, there may be some cost in talking to them. On the other hand, some programs you may want to have your stakeholder support before you spend money on legal help. It's going to be up to you and your program what's going to fit where there. And then last, be prepared to answer individual questions from your stakeholders because they probably will have a lot of questions about, you know, what do all these statistics mean? Why are we using them? You know, why can't we just catch cheating without it? You know, questions like that. So next slide. So in terms of program implementation, think of a three-tiered approach. You know, establish your scope. What are your goals? What do you want to do with them? Propose a budget, and that includes resources, not just dollars, and then create an action plan. You know, for the next year, we're going to collect data forensics, and then we're going to do X, Y, Z, or we're going to do X, Y, Z the minute we get the first report. Whatever it is you want to do, make sure you have that kind of planned out. And then you're going to use that approach to formulate your program, gain your stakeholder support, and then this is something that I've learned. Don't be afraid to revise it as you go. Sometimes you may think that some measurement that you think is going to tell you something, it turns out to not really tell you anything about your program. So you might want to fine-tune what it is that you're measuring. Okay, so next slide. So let's talk about budget and support a little bit more. So it's not if, it's when. Don't wait for a breach to occur before you seriously think about security. Again, data forensics is part of a process. And the process is to strengthen your program before bad things happen. You don't want to be in a position of explaining to anyone why, you know, 500 people cheated on this exam on this date, you know, because you could have done X, Y, Z beforehand. So you want to look at data forensics as sort of that preventative measure. Let me think here. One of the questions you may get, you know, from the stakeholders is, why do we need data forensics? Can't we just catch the cheaters without it? And again, this goes back to stressing that you're not catching the cheaters, you're catching the security holes in your program where cheaters might slip through, or exams might get out, or test centers may not be as secure as you'd like. It's finding those things up front that will prevent incidences later on. Next slide. Once you have your plan in place, you want to assemble the security team. And so that may be some departments, that may be just you. And some, it may be your exam development team, your psychometrics, your exam administration, for instance, your exam delivery provider, your legal team, any risk management you have, scoring and grading, and any professional conduct boards or review that you have too that may look at how individuals have violated your programs and how data forensics fit into that. Next slide. Okay, so making the case for security. You know, again, the core tenet here is that exam scores mean nothing if candidates can gain an unfair advantage by cheating. Data forensics will help you figure out where potential risk for cheaters, potential risk in your program where cheaters can kind of slip through, can help you identify that. You may want to share the examples of individuals gaining an unfair advantage. For instance, Dennis mentioned a couple of instances that were in the news. I'm sure that there's plenty out there. You want to avoid being a news story, in other words. And then you want to present the cost of security versus insecurity. So about the cost, you know, breaches or security incidences can cost you both in tangible terms, such as having to rescore a test, having to redevelop a test, redeliver an exam. And then there's the intangible costs, the reputation to your security program or your overall exam program, the integrity of your program. These are things that you want to avoid. Next slide. And then this is just, again, going over what a successful implementation is. Propose a security budget, identify the key individuals and their roles. What is the time commitment? That may be hard to identify up front if you're just starting out, but once you get a few reports and once you start working with data forensics a little bit more, then you can kind of decide what is the appropriate amount of time to be spending analyzing results and then implementing any actions from them. Develop and document process flows. Anticipate and overcome obstacles. You know, you may have stakeholders who really have a fear of statistics because they don't understand them and they don't understand how to use them and they don't understand how, you know, legally defensible they may be, or they may think that they are kind of in a bad light. The public doesn't like us to do things based on data forensics. You need to think about all of those things when getting your stakeholder support and make sure that you allay those fears. And then I just went over that, yeah, fear of what people might think. So I think next slide. And so I think that covered it. So questions?
Yeah, so if there are questions about implementing a data forensics program, you can share them now. And otherwise, let's go to the next slide. We've got another poll, and this one asks, what do you think is or will be the biggest obstacle to gaining stakeholder support for implementing a data forensics program? Please select one of these, and we'll just go for a few seconds here, about 30 seconds, because we don't want to run over the hour. Oh, interesting. Well, I thought for sure it would be budget, and it is. Let's see, we're at 38 seconds. I'm going, 62% have voted. Still got more people voting. I'm going to close this now, just in the interest of time, and share the results. Budget is the biggest challenge, which doesn't surprise me, but what surprises me is the lack of knowledge or understanding about data forensics appears to be a significant barrier also. So I think as an industry, maybe we can take something away that we need to do a better job of educating on the use of these statistics. Now I'm going to close this out. And Skylar, next slide, please. And we'll turn things over to Jennifer Semko. Jennifer?
Hey, everybody. This is Jennifer. You can move on to the next slide, Skylar. So I threw this cartoon in here, and why is that? Well, first of all, sometimes when lawyers speak, people fall asleep. So I wanted to wake you up a bit. But I think this cartoon, which has been around for a while, it really captures the essence of why exam security is so important. And as you've heard from Dennis and Carrie, data forensics can be a key component of your exam security program. But I just love this cartoon. Anyway, moving on to the next slide, we'll talk a bit about the legal foundation for your data forensics program. And a question that I frequently get is, well, gee, are data forensics even legal? If we get this data, can we really legally act on it? And the answer is, of course. so long as you do it in the right way. And I note that in the poll, fear of legal consequences was one significant obstacle identified by some of you. So let's talk a little bit more about the legal foundation and the proper way to approach your data forensics program. So the first brick, the first foundational piece of your exam security program is actually the candidate agreement. That might be a registration agreement. It might be an honor code if you're in the educational context. But whatever form it might take, the candidate agreement is, at the end of the day, a contract. And I've got the basic legal definition of a contract here, and it sheds a lot of light on this in that it explains an agreement. A contract is an agreement between two or more persons which creates an obligation to do or not to do a particular thing. So this is your contract, your agreement with test takers, and it defines your relationship with them. And if it is drafted properly, it puts in black and white, it memorializes your rights and obligations and their rights and obligations. And this makes the expectations on both sides and the remedies available in the event of a breach very clear. So I can't emphasize enough how significant the candidate agreement is. So moving on to the next slide, this is some food for thought. Are candidates on notice that sharing items is a breach? I can't tell you how many people I've encountered who have said, well, gee, back in high school, the first thing I did after I took an exam was to go and tell all of my friends what I saw on the test. If that's the kind of behavior you want to prohibit, you need to make that abundantly clear in your candidate agreement. Next, are candidates on notice that studying from recalled items is improper? So they've got a friend who took the exam, or they see a posting on the internet. Here are 20 questions I saw on the exam. If your program is designed in a way that having advanced access to questions creates an unfair advantage, you need to make it abundantly clear to candidates that they should not engage in that, and that if they do, that there are consequences. Next, do you reserve the right to invalidate a score, or to suspend someone's access to the exam, or permanently ban them, or to do other, impose other sanctions? If so, you want to reserve that right in the agreement, and there's no one-size-fits-all language or clause to throw in. It really depends on your particular program, but it is typically wise to put candidates on notice that you have the right in your sole discretion to take action in the event of exam irregularities or an unreliable score. Next, are candidates on notice that you might be using data forensics? This may or may not really be a legal requirement, but it can be an intriguing deterrent. Candidates know that you are going to be using some sophisticated analysis to examine their score results. Next bullet, what are the grounds for action? What sorts of activities will trigger your right to take action? Do you have a catch-all provision in there? I usually highly recommend a catch-all that might say something along the lines of, we reserve the right in our sole discretion to take other necessary action in the event that the validity of the score is, in our view, in question. Something that's broad enough to give you some contractual right to take some action. Next, and Carrie hinted at this, this is a living, breathing program. You should regularly review your agreement, as well as reviewing your overall security program in your data forensics plan. You may encounter a situation that you didn't anticipate previously, and it may warrant some changes to your candidate agreement. So think of it as a living and breathing document. And next, do you have uniform security procedures and policies in place? Your candidate agreement may be great, but then in the event of a security breach, if you haven't thought through what procedures you're going to implement, what your more detailed policies are, those are not things you want to be designing in crisis mode. Additionally, if you have policies and procedures in place, you will better be able to consistently treat candidates consistently and to apply these policies and procedures uniformly, as opposed to just making things up as you go. And finally, something to think about: are candidates required to cooperate in investigations? I've encountered some test programs that have a standalone cooperation obligation in their candidate agreement. And this can be a very useful tool in the event that you believe you will need information and assistance from candidates with respect to investigations you may be conducting in the future of exam irregularities. So moving on to the next slide. Problem has arisen, and you've got your data forensic in hand and you've taken action. Are you going to be able to defend those actions in the event that a legal challenge is brought? And the primary way this question manifests itself is, gee, do I have to prove quote-unquote cheating? And the answer, at least from the reported cases out there, is pretty clearly no. You do not have to prove cheating. So what will the courts expect of you? Well, generally, courts will treat challenges to an exam program's actions as a matter of contract law. In other words, they will look at your candidate agreement and ask, did you implement and abide by your contract with your test taker in good faith? Good faith is oftentimes really the key aspect of your behavior that the court is going to look to. So the court will look at the language of your agreement. Was the candidate on notice that you could invalidate their score? Was the candidate aware of potential consequences and prohibited behavior? Did you have documented policies and procedures that you followed and implemented? In other words, did you take all the steps necessary to show your good faith? That's generally what the courts will look to. In just a moment, we'll look at two very significant federal appellate cases where this has come up. So also consider, will you need expert testimony? Chances are, if you are going to be relying on data forensics to justify in whole or in part your decision, you are going to need an expert, whether it's Dennis or somebody else, to sit on the stand and explain to the arbitrator or the judge or the jury, this is the analysis that we did and this is what it showed. And obviously, I'm certainly no psychometrician or statistician, and many of you are not. I challenge you to find any jurors or judges who are. So not only will your expert need to know what they're doing, but they'll have to be able to explain it in a way that an ordinary layperson can understand. And finally, deference to exam programs is something that thankfully we see reflected in many written decisions addressing these issues. Courts seem to acknowledge and recognize the important public policy behind allowing testing programs to do what they need to do to stand behind the validity of their scores. However, just a little caveat here, for state actors out there, whether you are a state university or a government entity of some kind, you very likely are going to be held to a slightly higher standard. Because you are a government actor, you will have to demonstrate that you've complied with constitutional due process and other constitutional rights owed to American citizens. So moving on to the next slide, I talked about that day when Dennis is sitting on the stand explaining to the judge, jury, or arbitrator his analysis. Well, the judge is not going to just let any old guy sit on the stand and talk about anything. For example, if Dennis were to propose that all redheads have a higher chance of cheating, chances are the judge is not going to permit that sort of testimony. Instead, the judge is going to evaluate expert testimony based largely on what I have up here on this slide, Federal Rule of Evidence 702. And there are three components. The testimony has to be based on scientific facts or data. It's got to be the product of reliable principles and methods, i.e., no crazy theories about redheads. There are plenty in my family. And finally, it has to be shown that the witness has applied those principles and methods reliably to the particular facts of the case. So the judge is very much a gatekeeper, and his or her job is to weed out junk science and make sure that the jury or the fact finder only hears scientific expert testimony that is reliable and relevant. So moving on briefly to the next slide, these are two U.S. Supreme Court cases where the court comments on expert testimony, and not surprisingly, the court makes it pretty clear to us that the judge's role is to ensure that scientific testimony or evidence is not only relevant, but reliable. And as you see from Kumho Tire, the second case, the Supreme Court tells us that the judge must make sure that the expert employs in the courtroom the same level of intellectual rigor that characterizes the practice of an expert in the relevant field. So these are issues to bear in mind while you are deliberating and deciding what to do in the face of some compelling data forensic evidence. What's Dennis going to say on the stand? What is your forensic expert going to, how is he or she going to explain the analysis? Will it make sense to a layperson? Is it reliable? Is it a trustworthy analytical method? So moving on briefly. Oh, sorry.
Jennifer, it's Steve. Sorry, just time check. We've got about 11 minutes left, and I know you've got some ground to cover.
Okay. So we'll pause for 20 seconds on my next cartoon and move on. The point of this is basically to just explain, yes, I've told you courts are deferential to exam programs, but they're not going to let you chop heads off. So moving on to the next slide. My next two slides talk about the Murray case and the Langston case. And the point of these two cases is pretty clear, and it just reinforces what I told you a moment ago, that the court is going to look at the contract language and whether you applied that language in good faith. So here Mr. Murray was an athlete. He scored a 700 on the SAT, and then he took it a second time, and his score shot up to an astounding 1,300. ETS took a closer look at the similarity of his answers to that of a nearby student, and their data forensics showed that the two students performed so similarly that the odds of that performance, that similarity occurring by chance, were less than 3 in 100 million. So that's the kind of statistic that I, as a lawyer, would feel very comfortable presenting to a judge as justification for a score invalidation. Ultimately, this basketball player sued ETS and said they can't prove that I did anything wrong, they can't prove that I cheated, and this language is key here from the court's opinion. ETS's contract clearly and explicitly reserved to ETS the right to withhold any scores ETS had reason to believe were not valid. The only contractual duty ETS owed to Murray was to investigate the validity of his scores in good faith. So we can move on very briefly to the next slide. It's a very similar case. Different court of appeals, similar conclusion, that the outcome does not turn on whether or not this athlete cheated, but only on whether ACT carried out its contractual obligations in good faith. So moving on to managing test security investigation. So a breach has occurred, or you've got a statistical anomaly, and it's time to investigate. I think we have a quick question here.
We won't take too much time here, but have you ever encountered a security breach that required an investigation? So if, well, we've got people answering quickly, and 65% have voted. We'll keep it open for about 5 more seconds. And we'll close it. Share the answers. And Jennifer, I don't know if you can see this, but 78% have unfortunately dealt with a investigation. I'm going to hide this and let you keep going.
And that result is not a surprise at all. And I think there are 22% of you out there who should brace yourselves because, as Carrie said, it's not if, it's when. So moving on to the next slide, managing an investigation. Here are just some points to bear in mind when that breach or that incident occurs and you're doing everything you can to gather all the facts and data. First, do your investigators have everything they need to be effective? And that can include corporate support. Do they have the money they need? Are they trained? Have you consulted either in-house legal resources or external counsel to evaluate the issues relevant to this particular breach or your program? They may need access to software, internet resources, technology. Do they have that? And do they have the support they need from other departments within your organization, whether it's the psychometricians who can explain to them why the data forensics looks strange, or the test development folks. There are a variety of individuals in your organization who almost certainly will have relevant information for them. What procedure is in place to select cases for investigation? In most instances, it's simply not feasible to investigate every single matter, no matter its size. So your program may have to prioritize and determine what trigger points will cause you to move forward with an investigation. And then how do you evaluate the success or the efficiency of your investigation? Will you, at the end of an investigation, have components in place to evaluate whether you got the information you needed so that you can improve the process for the next time? Have you determined when and how your organization closes an investigation? At what point do you stop and call for a decision? The next slide, think about who is going to be conducting investigations. Is it your director of exam security? Is it an administrator? Is it outside counsel? Is it a third party of some other kind? And when will the investigation begin? And this is going to likely depend on the type of investigation we are talking about. If it's an exam day incident, someone caught with scratch paper, are your proctors armed with the information and the knowledge they need to document and investigate those sorts of incidents? If it's ongoing copyright infringement by individuals or by a test prep company, you're going to have a slightly different type of investigation and investigators. And same for collusion among candidates or proxy testing. Think about in advance at what point you bring in lawyers or your board or other departments. Are you going to wait until you are ready to make a decision, or are these stakeholders that you need to bring in earlier in the process? Do your policies and procedures reflect what is needed to manage investigations? And in particular, as I mentioned earlier, are candidates obligated to cooperate? And if they're not, how are you going to handle that? And then finally, how are you going to report the results, and who makes a sanctions decision? And related to that, can the candidates file some sort of appeal? And if they do, who evaluates their appeal, and based on what? So these are all things to think about. Again, there's no cookie cutter answer. Every program is a little bit different, but better to be thinking about these issues now than in crisis mode when a security breach has occurred. The next slides we can touch on really briefly. Obviously, the primary purpose of your investigation is to gather evidence, and these bulleted items are just some examples of the type of evidence you likely will want to gather up. Similarity analyses, gain score analyses, and other statistics. So Dennis comes to you and says, there's something very strange going on in test site 104 among these 50 candidates. Take a look at them. How do their scores on this anomalous day compare to when they took the exam 6 months ago? Are there reports of security incidents? Did the proctor note anything unusual? Look at the seating charts. Where were these candidates seated in relationship to one another? The chain of custody materials. Did you lose sight of a test booklet, or did a computer crash? All of these items on this list are bits of information you'll want to have in your pocket so that your decision maker, whoever it may be, can have everything they need in order to make a valid and fair decision. And then, of course, in the next slide, we'll see you want to evaluate the evidence. Are there alternative explanations for this? Has the candidate or the school or the test site offered explanations or responses, and are they convincing? Is it possible that you're talking about test fraud? And at the end of the day, the real thrust of all of this, are the test results trustworthy? Your evaluation depends upon the trustworthiness of the scores, not an inference of behavior. Language in this little box is key, and it echoes what Dennis and Carrie stated earlier, that the proper use of data forensics is to certify the trustworthiness of the test results and the integrity of the test administration, not to weed out cheaters or to give you a reason to label someone a cheater. And that's it for me.
All right, Jennifer, thanks so much. We wanted to wrap things up really quickly, but I see we're approaching the end of the hour. So if we lose folks, we will have this webinar, a recording of it available on our website, and the slides available, and any questions that are addressed after the hour that you may not be able to sit through, we'll have those Q&A on, no, go back please, Skylar. Go back please, Skylar. We'll have the questions available on our LinkedIn group. But just, we covered a lot of ground, and I thought it would be helpful to quickly share the key takeaways. Dennis talked about an intro to data forensics. You really can use statistics to measure threats and proactively manage against them. Carrie talked about program implementation. Such a key point here. Security is a process. It's not a state. You're never going to be at the place where, hey, my program is now secure. I have nothing else to worry about. She also shared that if you're a high-stakes program, if the results really matter, it's not if, it's when. And if that's the case, like my accountant says, nobody plans to fail, but many people fail to plan. So figuring out what you're going to do when a bad thing happens is really key. Next slide. I've heard Jennifer talk on these legal points several times, and I loved how she reinforces that the agreement is the foundation of your test security program. And we see that even in K-12. There was a question about this. One of our clients is a State Department of Education. They have students sign an oath before an administration of a state assessment. It's not legally binding, but it does let the kids know that cheating is not allowed and that scores can be invalidated if they are statistically indeterminate. On the legal piece, Jennifer talked about how key it is to have consistent and uniform adherence of policies. I was involved in a court case for a different state where a lower court ruled against the State Department of Education. The State Department of Education had invalidated a student's score. Lower court found for the student. But then the Supreme Court said, no, because the Department of Education applied its policies uniformly and consistently across the state, we will not allow the lower court to overturn that invalidation. So do be uniform and consistent. Don't be arbitrary and capricious. And then just need to reinforce, lastly, focus on the results, not the behaviors. We're not calling someone a cheater. We're saying the result is statistically indeterminate. Dennis, we had a question from your section, which was, without eyewitness account, what probability should be used when using data forensics. Do you want to speak to that quickly?
Sure. So we talked about it's a matter of context and getting everything together. And the probability, so it's not just like doing an experiment. It usually depends on the client and policy, but usually where we are is probabilities that are about 1 in 100,000. If you're looking for a number, well, I've seen in the literature people talk about probabilities of 1 in 10,000. So, there's not uniform agreement. There's not an industry-accepted standard. So definitely when you're data mining and monitoring, not investigating, but data mining, you need to be more conservative. Those probabilities need to be even smaller before you take action.
Thanks, Dennis. And then once you have figured out what policy makes sense for your organization, again, apply those policies uniformly. Another question, and this was for Jennifer, can you explain the advantages or the need to copyright your tests? And then
Sure.
How do you do that without public record exposure?
Okay. Boy, we could do a whole webinar on this, but many folks have heard the old adage that anything that is written down on paper is automatically protected by copyright law. So you type up a great novel at home, it is automatically protected by U.S. copyright law, and that is absolutely true. But what many people don't realize is the second piece of that you can't do anything with your copyrights. You can't stop anyone from infringing or sue them for infringement unless and until you have registered your work with the U.S. Copyright Office. So if you were to discover tomorrow that a test prep company is publishing copies of your exam for profit, unless you have registered your exams, you won't be able to take any legal action against them just yet. So you would have to race over to the Copyright Office, file registrations on an expedited basis, get your certificate in hand or at least proof of your application, and then you could bring legal action. And because you waited until after the infringement occurred, you have lost the ability to, in your legal action, claim your attorney's fees and what we call statutory damages. So the bottom line is you're still protected by the copyright laws if you haven't registered your exams, but you can't take any legal action until they are registered. And if you register now, before the infringement occurs, you will have the added benefit of being able to get from the infringer, if you prevail, your attorney's fees and statutory damages. So absolutely positively, I strongly recommend that you register your exams. You can do so in a way that completely protects the confidentiality of your exams. Believe it or not, the Copyright Office has a special registration process just for secure tests. Ordinarily, if you'd written that novel in your basement, you have to deposit a full copy of your novel with the Copyright Office so that the public is aware of what copyright is claimed. But for secure tests, you can deposit redacted sample questions, and that's it. Now, the catch is you have to go in person to the Copyright Office in Washington, D.C. with a full copy of your exam or your question database, show it to an examiner, but you get to take it home with you when you leave, and you leave behind only a redacted copy of some sample questions. I'd be happy to explain that in more detail and even point you to some online resources if you just email me later. We frequently help folks get their exams registered since we're right down the street from the Copyright Office. But please do it if you don't already.
Jennifer, you said we could do a webinar. I hadn't sprung that on you, but we wanted to engage with you on when we had a question recently, and we want to get that on the calendar, so we may hit you up.
Sure thing.
And folks, I asked in front of the audience, so she'd have to say yes because she's So one last question. This was in regards, Jennifer, to agreements. How do you address the fact that K-12 students are minors and unable to enter into a legally binding contract? Do you have a perspective on that?
Well, certainly, because you're dealing with minors, your remedies are going to be limited. So, for example, if a group of 5th graders cheats on a particular exam, you're probably not going to be able to go to court and sue them for damages and make them pay for the cost to redesign the exam and your other damages. That being said, by having them, and Steve mentioned this before, by having them sign an honor code, putting them on notice of what they can and cannot do, that's going to give you a little extra protection when you invalidate the score and their angry mom and dad call up and say, you know, you can't do this. So it's certainly important to have the expectations clear up front, but you're correct that because you're dealing with minors, you're not going to have the full arsenal, so to speak, of legal remedies in the event that the honor code or the agreement is breached. But I don't think any of you really want to go and claim monetary damages from elementary students anyway. But I hope that helps.
Great. Thank you so much. So we have run long. We really strive to keep these sessions under an hour. Apologize for that. But holy smokes, what great content from 3 experts in the use of data forensics. Thank you all very much for joining us. If we go to the next slide, we're going to show the emails addresses for Carrie, Jennifer, and Dennis if you have any questions. And then lastly, stay tuned for news on upcoming Cavion events. So if you're in state assessment, we may see you at the CCSSO SCAS meeting. We're going to have a webinar next month focused kind of on school districts, but it's about how to do your own security audit and security investigations. And then we'll be at the ICE conference later. So thank you all very much. Hope you have a great day, a great month, and we'll see you next time.